The head of the Great Sphinx of Giza does not match its body. This is not speculation. This is observable fact. The head is dramatically too small for the massive leonine body beneath it. Every other Egyptian sculpture maintains perfect proportions. The Sphinx alone breaks this rule. Tonight, we examine what geology and ancient texts reveal about what this monument was before someone recarved its face. What terrified a civilization into erasing the original head of their most sacred guardian? What did the Sphinx look like before Egypt existed? And why did they need us to forget? This is the story they tried to erase. Imagine standing at the edge of the Giza Plateau just before dawn. The air is cool and carries the faint mineral scent of limestone dust that has settled here for millennia. Before you rises a shape so familiar from photographs and films that you might think you know it completely. But something shifts when you stand in its presence. The Great Sphinx of Giza emerges from the shadows as the first light touches its weathered face. And in that light, you notice something that photographs rarely capture. The head is small. Not just slightly undersized, but dramatically, almost awkwardly small compared to the enormous body stretched out behind it. The body of the Sphinx measures approximately 240 feet long and 66 feet high. It is massive. The paws alone extend 50 feet forward from the chest. The haunches rise with muscular definition that suggests a powerful feline frozen mid-rest. This is a body built on a monumental scale, carved with confidence and precision from the living bedrock of the plateau. And yet, the head perched atop this magnificent form seems to belong to a different sculpture entirely. If you were to scale the head to match the proportions of the body using standard Egyptian artistic conventions, the head should be significantly larger than what we see today. Art historians and anatomists who have studied the Sphinx note that the head-to-body ratio is simply wrong. It does not match the proportions found in any other Egyptian sculpture across 3,000 years of dynastic artistic production. This matters because the ancient Egyptians were not careless artists. They were in fact obsessed with proportion. Their entire civilization was built upon the concept of Mat, the principle of cosmic order, balance, and harmony that governed everything from the flooding of the Nile to the structure of their temples to the precise mathematical relationships encoded in their art. Egyptian sculptors followed strict canonical proportions when depicting the human form. These proportions were not arbitrary aesthetic choices, but sacred mathematics that reflected the divine order of the universe. A figure's height was measured in exact units. The distance from hairline to chin followed precise ratios. The width of shoulders related mathematically to the length of arms. These rules were followed with remarkable consistency across centuries and across the entire length of Egypt, from the Delta to Nubia. When you examine the thousands of Egyptian statues that survive in museums around the world, you find this proportional consistency repeated again and again. Whether the statue is 3 inches tall or 30 feet tall, the proportions remain harmonious. The head always fits the body. The face always matches the frame, except at Giza, except with the Sphinx. Here alone, among all Egyptian monuments, the proportions fail. The head is too small. Some researchers have calculated that if the original head matched the body proportionally, it would have been significantly larger, perhaps extending much further forward than the current face. This suggests something that mainstream Egyptology has been reluctant to address directly. The head we see today may not be the original head. Consider what this implies. If Egyptian artists never made proportional errors of this magnitude on any other sculpture, then the anomaly of the Sphinx demands explanation. The simplest explanation, the one that accounts for all observable evidence, is that the current head was recarved from something larger. Something that once fit the body. Something that was removed and replaced with the smaller human face we see today. Now stand before the Sphinx at midday, when the sun illuminates every detail, and you can observe the evidence yourself. The neck shows a pronounced indentation where it meets the shoulders, suggesting that material was removed and reshaped. The face itself shows less weathering than the body, as if it were carved more recently from stone that had already been protected within a larger original form. The royal headdress that frames the face, the nemes, it extends backward in a way that seems designed to mask the transition between the newer carved face and the older stone behind it. These are not wild speculations. These are observable features that anyone can verify by examining photographs or visiting the site in person. Something happened to the head of the Sphinx. Something that transformed it from its original form into what we see today. But what was the original form? What face did the Sphinx wear before it was given the features of a pharaoh? This question leads us into territory that mainstream archaeology prefers to avoid. But proportion alone might be explained away as artistic choice. Perhaps the builders simply preferred a smaller head for aesthetic reasons. Perhaps there was some symbolic meaning we no longer understand. These explanations feel weak, but they cannot be entirely dismissed based on visual evidence alone. What cannot be explained away is what a Yale-trained geologist discovered when he examined not the shape of the Sphinx, but the patterns carved into its body by something far older than wind or sand. In 1990, a geologist named Robert Schoch traveled to Egypt. Schoch had earned his doctorate in geology and geophysics from Yale University, one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. He was a tenured professor at Boston University, where he taught courses in science and scientific thinking. He was not a fringe theorist or an amateur enthusiast. He was a credentialed scientist with decades of training in reading the stories that rocks tell through their textures, their layers, and their patterns of erosion. Schoch had been invited to Egypt by an independent researcher named John Anthony West, who had proposed a controversial hypothesis. West believed that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx were inconsistent with its accepted age. He needed a geologist with unimpeachable credentials to evaluate the evidence. Schoch expected to spend a few days examining the monument and then return home to explain why West was mistaken. Instead, what Schoch found at Giza would challenge everything he thought he knew about ancient history. The evidence was carved into the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the rectangular pit that surrounds the body of the Sphinx, where it was carved out of the bedrock. When Schoch examined these walls, he immediately recognized a pattern that told a very specific geological story. The walls showed deep vertical fissures and undulating horizontal channels. This pattern is unmistakable to any trained geologist. It is the signature of water erosion, specifically the erosion caused by rainfall and water runoff over extended periods of time. Schoch knew this pattern well. He had seen it on limestone formations around the world in regions with significant precipitation. Water flows down vertical surfaces and carves distinctive channels. It pools in horizontal depressions and creates rounded, undulating features. The pattern is completely different from wind erosion, which tends to create horizontal striations and sharp angular features as sand particles blast against stone surfaces. At Giza, Schoch found both patterns, but in different locations. The Sphinx enclosure showed the unmistakable signatures of water erosion. But when he examined nearby structures that Egyptologists confidently dated to the Old Kingdom period, around 2500 BCE, he found only wind erosion. This was the critical observation. If the Sphinx and the nearby tombs were built at the same time as mainstream archaeology claims, then they should show the same erosion patterns. They are made of the same limestone. Or they sit on the same plateau, exposed to the same environmental conditions. If wind and sand were responsible for the erosion on the Sphinx, then wind and sand should have created identical patterns on the 4th dynasty tombs just a few hundred meters away. But the erosion patterns are completely different. The tombs show horizontal weathering consistent with wind and sand over approximately 4,500 years. The Sphinx enclosure shows vertical weathering consistent with water and rainfall over a period that must have been much longer. This observation created a profound problem for the conventional dating of the Sphinx. Egypt has been arid for approximately 5,000 years. The Sahara Desert expanded to encompass the Nile Valley around 3000 BCE, and significant rainfall became rare. Before that time, however, the climate was very different. Between roughly 10,000 BCE and 5000 BCE, the Sahara was green. It was a savanna with lakes and rivers and seasonal monsoons. Rainfall was abundant. This period is known to climatologists as the African humid period, or sometimes the Neolithic subpluvial. During this era, the region that is now barren desert supported diverse ecosystems, human settlements, and yes, significant precipitation. If the Sphinx shows water erosion, then it must have been exposed to that water. And if the water stopped falling 5,000 years ago, then the Sphinx must have existed before the rains ended. This was Schoch's conclusion. Based on the geological evidence, the core body of the Sphinx must date to at least 5000 BCE and possibly much earlier. In 1991, Schoch presented his findings at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America. This was not a fringe conference or an alternative history gathering. This was one of the most respected professional organizations for geologists in the world. Schoch stood before his peers and presented the evidence. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx were consistent with prolonged exposure to rainfall. The erosion patterns on nearby Old Kingdom structures were consistent only with wind. The logical conclusion was that the Sphinx predated the Old Kingdom by thousands of years. The presentation generated significant controversy. Egyptologists pushed back forcefully, arguing that the archaeological context made an older date impossible. Where was the evidence of the civilization that built an earlier Sphinx? Where were their tools, their settlements, their other monuments? But Schoch was not making archaeological claims. He was reporting geological observations, and the geology was clear. The Sphinx had been weathered by water, not just a little water, not a brief flood or an occasional storm. The depth and pattern of the erosion indicated prolonged exposure to significant precipitation. The kind of precipitation that had not fallen on the Giza Plateau for at least 5,000 years, and possibly much longer. Mainstream archaeology has never adequately addressed Schoch's findings. Some researchers have proposed alternative explanations. Perhaps groundwater wicking up through the limestone created the erosion patterns. Perhaps the Sphinx was carved near an ancient waterway that has since disappeared. Perhaps some unknown chemical process mimicked the appearance of water erosion. But each of these alternatives has problems. The groundwater hypothesis cannot explain why the erosion patterns appear high on the enclosure walls, far above any plausible water table. The waterway hypothesis leaves no geological evidence of its existence. The chemical process hypothesis remains entirely theoretical with no supporting evidence. Meanwhile, the simplest explanation continues to fit all observed facts. The Sphinx shows water erosion because it was exposed to water. It was exposed to water because it existed during a time when rain fell on the Giza Plateau. That time ended approximately 5,000 years ago, which means the Sphinx is at least 7,000 years old and possibly much older. Some researchers, including Schoch himself, have pushed the date back even further to around 10,000 BCE based on the depth of weathering and the climatic data for the region. This would place the construction of the Sphinx at the end of the last ice age. 12,000 years ago, nearly 8,000 years before the first pharaoh unified Egypt. So the geology suggests that the Sphinx, or at least its body, existed during a time when rain fell upon the Sahara, a time before the desert, a time that predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. But there is more evidence. Hidden beneath the pores of the Sphinx, Schoch's team found something that the Egyptian authorities have been very reluctant to investigate further. During his geological survey, Schoch employed seismic refraction equipment to study the subsurface structure around the Sphinx. This technology uses sound waves to map underground features. A controlled sound is generated at the surface, and sensitive instruments measure how the waves bounce back from structures below. Different materials reflect sound differently, allowing researchers to detect cavities, chambers, and variations in the bedrock. When Schoch's team ran their seismic surveys around the Sphinx, they detected something unexpected beneath the left pore. The data indicated the presence of a rectangular cavity, a void in the bedrock that appeared to be a constructed chamber rather than a natural geological formation. The chamber appeared to be roughly 9 meters below the surface. Similar anomalies were detected in other locations around the Sphinx, though the data was not always consistent enough to draw firm conclusions. The existence of chambers beneath the Sphinx had been speculated about for centuries. Ancient traditions spoke of hidden repositories of knowledge sealed beneath the monument. In the 1930s, an American mystic named Edgar Cayce had famously predicted that a haul of records would be discovered beneath the Sphinx, containing documents from a lost civilization. Cayce claimed this discovery would occur before the end of the 20th century and would revolutionize human understanding of history. Whether one finds Cayce credible or not, the seismic data presented a testable hypothesis. There appeared to be chambers beneath the Sphinx. The technology existed to investigate them further. Ground-penetrating radar, fiber optic cameras, and careful excavation could determine once and for all whether constructed spaces existed below the monument, and if so, what they contained. But when researchers requested permission to conduct more detailed investigations, the Egyptian authorities declined. Permits were denied. Access was restricted. The chambers, if they exist, remain unexplored to this day. This refusal to investigate raises uncomfortable questions. If the chambers are empty or natural formations, then investigation would prove this and silence the speculation forever. If the chambers contain nothing of significance, then opening them would harm no one. The reluctance to look suggests a fear of what might be found. Perhaps the authorities genuinely believe the chambers do not exist and consider further investigation a waste of resources. Perhaps bureaucratic inertia and a desire to protect the monument from damage explains the restrictions. These charitable explanations are possible. But another possibility lingers. Perhaps those who control access to the Sphinx suspect that investigation might reveal something that challenges the official history, something that raises questions about who truly built this monument and when, and something that connects to traditions and knowledge that powerful institutions would prefer remain buried. We cannot know what lies beneath the Sphinx without investigation. What we can know is that the investigation has been prevented. Draw your own conclusions about why. So we have a monument with the wrong proportions, erosion that does not match its supposed age, and unexplored chambers beneath it. Any one of these anomalies would warrant investigation. Together, they suggest something that mainstream archaeology is not prepared to admit. The Sphinx is far older than the civilization that claims to have built it. And if the Egyptians did not build it, then who did? For that answer, we must turn to the ancient texts themselves. And here we encounter perhaps the strangest anomaly of all. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. They documented everything. We have extensive records describing the construction of the pyramids, including the names of the workers who built them, the villages where they lived, the food they ate, and the administrative structures that organized their labor. We have temple inscriptions detailing every phase of construction, from the laying of foundations to the final dedication ceremonies. We have tomb autobiographies in which officials boast of their roles in building monuments for their kings. The Egyptian bureaucracy generated an enormous volume of written records, and thousands of these documents have survived across the millennia. We know more about the daily operations of ancient Egypt than we know about many medieval European kingdoms. Given this wealth of documentation, you would expect extensive records describing the construction of the Great Sphinx, the largest and most impressive sculpture in Egypt, a monument so significant that it has become synonymous with the civilization itself. You would expect inscriptions naming the pharaoh who commissioned it, the architects who designed it, the workers who carved it from the living rock. You would expect praise poems celebrating its completion and religious texts explaining its sacred significance. You would expect exactly the kind of documentation that exists for virtually every other major Egyptian monument. Instead, we find silence. No ancient Egyptian text describes the construction of the Sphinx. Not one. Among the thousands of surviving documents from ancient Egypt, not a single text claims credit for building this monument. Not a single inscription names its architect. Not a single record describes the labor force that carved it or the rituals that consecrated it. This absence is not for lack of trying. Egyptologists have searched exhaustively for references to the Sphinx's construction. They have translated every inscription on the Giza Plateau and examined every document from the Old Kingdom period when the Sphinx was supposedly built. The search has been thorough, and the result has been consistent. Nothing. The first known textual reference to the Sphinx, appears more than 1,000 years after its supposed construction date. Between the paws of the Sphinx stands a granite slab known as the Dream Stele, erected by Pharaoh Thutmose IV around 1400 BCE. The inscription on this stele tells a remarkable story. When Thutmose was still a prince, he fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx, which was buried up to its shoulders in sand. The monument came to him in a dream and promised that if Thutmose cleared away the sand and restored the Sphinx to its former glory, then he would become pharaoh. Thutmose did as the dream commanded. He excavated the Sphinx and restored it, and he did indeed become pharaoh. The dream stele is significant for what it reveals and what it conceals. It reveals that by 1400 BCE, the Sphinx was already ancient and in a state of disrepair. The monument required restoration, implying that considerable time had passed since its creation. It also suggests that the Sphinx was considered sacred and powerful, capable of conferring kingship on those who honored it. But the dream stele conceals something important. It never mentions who built the Sphinx. This would be the obvious place to credit the original creator, to connect Thutmose's restoration to the glorious ancestor who first carved the monument. Instead, the text simply refers to the Sphinx as if its origins were already lost to memory. Even the Egyptians of 1400 BCE apparently did not know or did not record who had created it. This silence speaks volumes. The Egyptians did not fail to document the construction of the Sphinx due to carelessness or lost records. They documented everything else. The silence suggests something more profound. The Egyptians did not record building the Sphinx because they did not build it. They inherited it. They found it already standing on the Giza plateau when their civilization arose. They may have restored it, recarved it, and incorporated it into their religious system. But they did not create it, and perhaps they did not know who did. And so we reach the end of the physical evidence: a body too large for its head, erosion too old for its supposed age, chambers that remain sealed, and a civilization strangely silent about how their greatest monument came to be. Let these facts settle in your mind as you rest. The proportions that do not match, the water that should not have fallen, the chambers that cannot be explored, the records that do not exist. Each anomaly might be explained individually. Together, they form a pattern that points toward a conclusion that mainstream archaeology refuses to consider. The Sphinx is older than Egypt. The Sphinx was modified to hide its original form. The Sphinx belongs to a chapter of human history that has been lost or deliberately erased. But if the Sphinx we see today is not the original, then what was it? To answer this, we must journey back further than Egyptology is willing to go. Back to a time the Egyptians themselves called sacred. A time before the pharaohs, before the dynasties, before history itself. They called it Zep Tepi, the first time. The ancient Egyptians had a name for the time before time. They called it Zep Tepi. In their language, these words meant the first time or the first occasion. It was the era when the world was new, when the waters of chaos had just receded, when the primordial mound first emerged from the depths, and when beings far greater than humans walked the earth and established the foundations of all that would follow. This was not presented in Egyptian texts as mythology in the way we understand that term today. The Egyptians did not distinguish between sacred history and factual history the way modern scholars do. To them, Zep-Tepi was as real and as historical as the reign of any pharaoh. It was the beginning of everything, the source from which all Egyptian civilization, religion, and knowledge flowed. And the records they left behind describe this era in remarkable detail. Among the most significant of these records is a document known as the Turin Royal Canon, or the Turin King List. This papyrus dates to the reign of Rameses II, around 1250 BCE, and it contains a comprehensive list of every ruler of Egypt from the earliest times to the New Kingdom. The document is damaged and fragmentary, but enough survives to reveal something extraordinary. The list does not begin with Menes, nor the pharaoh traditionally credited as the first human king of unified Egypt around 3100 BCE. Instead, it reaches back much further. Before the human pharaohs, the Turin King List records the reigns of divine beings. It speaks of a time when gods ruled Egypt directly. The god Ptah reigned for 9,000 years. The god Ra reigned for over 1,000 years. Shu, Geb, Osiris, Seth, and Horus each took their turns upon the throne. After the gods came the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, the demigods, or divine servants, who continued to rule for thousands of years more. Only after these divine dynasties did human pharaohs finally assume power. When scholars calculate the total time spans suggested by the Turin King List, the numbers are staggering. The divine reigns extend Egyptian history back over 36,000 years before the first human dynasty. This is not a minor discrepancy with conventional chronology. This is an entirely different conception of how long civilization has existed. Similar information appears on another ancient record known as the Palermo stone. This black basalt slab dates to the 5th dynasty around 2400 BCE, and it too lists rulers extending back into the pre-dynastic period. Though the Palermo stone is even more fragmentary than the Turin papyrus, the surviving portions confirm the same basic structure. Divine rulers preceded human rulers. The gods came first. The mainstream Egyptology has a standard response to these records. They are mythology. They are religious symbolism. They are not meant to be taken literally. The thousands of years assigned to divine rulers are ceremonial exaggerations meant to emphasize the sacred nature of kingship. No serious scholar would interpret these numbers as actual historical chronology, and yet a curious double standard operates here. When Egyptian texts describe the construction of temples and tombs, scholars accept these accounts as historical evidence. When administrative documents record the distribution of grain or the organization of labor, these are treated as reliable sources. The accuracy of Egyptian record-keeping is praised. Their bureaucratic precision is celebrated. But when those same meticulous record-keepers describe the rulers who preceded the pharaohs, suddenly they are dismissed as primitive myth-makers who cannot be trusted. We accept their construction records, but reject their king lists. We believe them when they describe how they built, but not when they describe who ruled. This selective acceptance deserves scrutiny. Either the Egyptians were reliable record keepers, or they were not. If they were, then their accounts of Zep-Tepi deserve serious consideration. If they were not, then perhaps we should be more skeptical of everything they recorded. What the texts describe is a time when divine beings called the Neteru established the patterns of civilization. They created the laws. They designed the temples. They laid out the sacred geography of Egypt. They taught humanity the arts of agriculture, architecture, medicine, and astronomy. And they were not distant creators who fashioned the world and departed. They were present rulers who walked among humans, who governed directly, who shaped every aspect of Egyptian life. And then, at some point, they left. The texts are less clear about this transition. The divine rulers gave way to the followers of Horus, who eventually gave way to human pharaohs. But the gods themselves departed. They ascended. They returned to the sky from which they had come. They left behind their monuments, and their teachings, and their bloodlines. But they themselves were gone. The Egyptians looked back on Zep-Tepi with reverence and longing. Every pharaoh sought to connect himself to that primordial time. Every temple was designed to mirror the patterns established in the first time. Every ritual was meant to reenact the sacred events of that original era. Zep-Tepi was the golden age, the time of perfection, the source from which all lesser ages flowed. And the monuments of Zep-Tepi, including perhaps the Sphinx itself, were the physical evidence that this golden age had really existed. So the Egyptians themselves recorded a time when divine beings ruled their land. Beings who built monuments. Beings who possessed knowledge. Beings who eventually left. But the Egyptians were not alone in recording such beings. Far to the east, in the cradle of civilization, another culture was writing about gods who descended from the heavens. And their descriptions would prove remarkably similar. The civilization of Sumer arose in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. Sumer is generally considered the oldest known civilization in the world, with its first cities emerging around 4500 BCE and its written records beginning around 3400 BCE. The Sumerians invented writing. They invented the wheel. They developed sophisticated mathematics, astronomy, and architecture. They created the first known legal codes and the first known literature. And they left behind thousands of clay tablets describing their history, their religion, and their understanding of the cosmos. Among the most significant concepts in Sumerian texts is the Anunnaki. This word is typically translated as those who from heaven to earth came, or sometimes as princely offspring, or those of royal seed. The Anunnaki were the gods of the Sumerian pantheon, the divine beings who descended from the sky to establish civilization on earth. According to Sumerian accounts, the Anunnaki came to earth in the distant past. They established settlements in Mesopotamia. They taught humans the arts of civilization. They ruled as kings and queens over the earliest cities. They possessed technologies and knowledge far beyond what humans could achieve on their own. And eventually, after long ages of direct rule, they departed, leaving humans to govern themselves under the guidance of the priests and kings who claimed descent from divine bloodlines. The parallels with Egyptian Zep-Tepi are striking. Both cultures describe a time when gods ruled directly. Both cultures describe these gods as coming from the sky or the heavens. Both cultures describe the gods establishing civilization and teaching humans. Both cultures describe the gods eventually departing. Both cultures organized their societies around the memory of this divine age and the desire to maintain connection with it. The Sumerian pantheon included Anu, the father of the gods who dwelt in the heavens, Enlil, the lord of the air and commander of the earth, Enki, the lord of wisdom and water who was particularly fond of humanity, Inanna, the queen of heaven associated with love and war. These and other Anunnaki ruled over a complex divine society with its own conflicts, alliances, and dramas. Many of the stories recorded in Sumerian tablets would later be adapted into Babylonian, Assyrian, and eventually biblical narratives. The flood story that appears in Genesis has a clear predecessor in the Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, who survived a great deluge sent by the gods. The Garden of Eden echoes the Sumerian concept of Dilmun, a paradise where the gods dwelt. The biblical Nephilim, the giants who walked the earth in ancient times, may reflect memories of the same beings the Sumerians called Anunnaki. Scholars typically explain these parallels as cultural diffusion. Stories spread from one civilization to another, adapting and changing as they traveled. The Hebrews borrowed from the Babylonians, who borrowed from the Sumerians. Shared themes reflect shared literary traditions, not shared historical experiences. And yet, another explanation remains possible. What if these parallel narratives reflect parallel memories? What if the Egyptians and the Sumerians and the Hebrews and dozens of other ancient cultures all describe the same events, because those events actually occurred? What if beings of some kind did walk the earth in the distant past? What if they did establish civilizations? What if they did eventually depart? What if the myths are memories? This possibility cannot be proven from texts alone. Stories can be invented, borrowed, or exaggerated. But the existence of parallel accounts across multiple independent cultures raises questions that deserve consideration. When Egyptian texts describe the Neteru and Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki, and both agree that divine beings once ruled the earth and then departed, we have two options. Either both cultures independently invented remarkably similar mythologies, or both cultures independently remembered remarkably similar histories. The physical evidence of the Sphinx, all with its impossible proportions and impossible erosion patterns, suggests that something existed in Egypt long before the pharaohs. The textual evidence of Zep-Tepi and the Anunnaki suggests that the ancients knew about this something and preserved its memory in their most sacred records. Neither the physical evidence nor the textual evidence is conclusive on its own. But together, they point toward a possibility that mainstream history refuses to consider. The possibility that human civilization is far older than we have been taught. The possibility that beings of some kind preceded us and built monuments we still cannot explain. The possibility that the past contains chapters that have been deliberately hidden or lost. Two civilizations, two sets of ancient texts, both describing an age when divine beings walked the earth, both describing their eventual departure. But if these beings truly existed, if they truly built monuments like the Sphinx, then we must ask, what did they look like? And could the original face of the Sphinx have been one of them? Return your attention to the Sphinx itself. We have established that the head does not match the body. We have established that the body shows erosion patterns dating back thousands of years before dynastic Egypt. We have established that ancient texts describe an era of divine rulers predating the pharaohs. Now let us consider what the original Sphinx might have looked like before it was recarved. Several theories have been proposed, each with its own evidence and logic. The first and perhaps most compelling theory is that the Sphinx originally depicted a lion. The body of the Sphinx is unmistakably feline. The proportions, the posture, the musculature all indicate a great cat at rest. Lions were deeply significant in Egyptian symbolism, representing royal power, the sun, and the horizon. A pure lion statue, without a human head, would have been entirely consistent with Egyptian iconography. The lion theory gains additional support from astronomy. Around 10,500 BCE, during the era when geological evidence suggests the Sphinx may have been carved, the constellation Leo rose directly behind the Sphinx at the spring equinox. The Sphinx faces due east, directly toward the rising sun. If it was built as a lion during this period, it would have been gazing at its celestial counterpart. Leo rising in the pre-dawn sky on the most important morning of the year. This astronomical alignment may not be coincidence. Ancient builders around the world demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of celestial cycles. The alignment of structures with stars and constellations appears repeatedly at sites from Angkor Wat to Stonehenge to the pyramids themselves. If the Sphinx was built as an astronomical marker, a monument to the age of Leo, then its original form as a pure lion would make perfect sense. Robert Schoch, the geologist whose water erosion research we discussed earlier, has proposed a variation on this theory. Based on his analysis of the proportions and geological features, Schoch believes the original Sphinx may have been a lioness rather than a male lion. The body shows no evidence of a mane, and the proportions suggest a female form. A lioness would have been associated with powerful Egyptian goddesses like Sekhmet and Tefnut, protectors and destroyers who embodied the fierce power of the sun. A second theory proposes that the Sphinx originally depicted Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. Anubis was the guardian of the necropolis, the protector of tombs and the guide of souls through the underworld. A massive statue of Anubis at the entrance to the Giza Plateau would have been entirely appropriate given the mortuary function of the pyramids nearby. Proponents of this theory note that the body of the Sphinx could be interpreted as canine rather than feline. The extended paws, the alert posture, the guardian position all fit with depictions of Anubis found throughout Egyptian art. If the original head was a jackal, the proportions would have worked, and a long pointed snout extending forward would have balanced the long body extending back. The recarving would have removed this snout and reshaped the remaining stone into a much smaller human face, explaining the current proportional mismatch. Critics of the Anubis theory point out that Anubis statues typically show the god in a crouching position with legs folded beneath the body, not extended forward as we see with the Sphinx. The posture does not perfectly match standard Anubis iconography. But iconographic standards may have changed over thousands of years, and an original Sphinx predating dynastic Egypt might not conform to later artistic conventions. A third possibility is that the original face depicted something else entirely. Something that does not fit neatly into Egyptian iconography as we understand it. Something that might have represented the beings of Zep-Tipi, the divine rulers who preceded the pharaohs. We cannot know what such beings looked like, because by definition they existed before Egyptian art developed its standard forms. If the Sphinx was built by or for the Neteru, its original appearance might have been unlike anything else that survives from ancient Egypt. Whatever the original form, the physical evidence strongly supports the conclusion that the Sphinx was recarved. The head is too small for the body. The face shows less weathering than the body, suggesting it was carved more recently from stone that had been protected within a larger form. The neck shows evidence of reshaping. a significant portion of the original head was removed and replaced with what we see today. The most common theory attributes this recarving to the Pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty around 2500 BCE. The face of the Sphinx has been compared to statues of Khafre, and some researchers see a resemblance. The Sphinx sits adjacent to the Valley Temple, associated with Khafre's pyramid complex. The association seems logical, but if Khafre recarved the Sphinx, he did not create it. He inherited a monument already ancient in his time, already weathered by thousands of years of rain that no longer fell. He took a guardian from a previous age and put his own face upon it. He claimed it for his dynasty and incorporated it into his mortuary complex. He erased whatever face had come before and replaced it with his own image, or the image of a generic pharaoh representing eternal kingship. So the evidence suggests the Sphinx once wore a different face. Perhaps a lion, perhaps a jackal, perhaps something we cannot yet imagine. But evidence of what it was tells us only half the story. The deeper question remains: why was it changed? What could possibly compel a civilization to alter the face of a monument they clearly held sacred? The answer may lie not in what the original face depicted, but in what it represented, and what the new rulers of Egypt desperately wanted to forget. The ancient Egyptians practiced something that scholars call damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. When a pharaoh wanted to erase a predecessor from history, they did not simply destroy that ruler's monuments. They systematically removed the predecessor's name from inscriptions, defaced their images, and rewrote records to eliminate any trace of their existence. This was not mere vandalism. It was a calculated assault on the predecessor's afterlife, since the Egyptians believed that being remembered was essential to eternal existence. We see evidence of damnatio memoriae throughout Egyptian history. After the pharaoh Hatshepsut died, her successor Thutmose III ordered her images destroyed and her name removed from monuments throughout Egypt. The heretic pharaoh Akhenaten suffered similar treatment. His revolutionary religious reforms were reversed, and his memory was systematically erased by later rulers who wanted to restore traditional practices. To erase someone from memory was to erase them from existence itself. Now consider the Sphinx through this lens. If the monument predated the pharaohs, if it was built by or for beings who ruled during Zep-Tepi, then the dynastic Egyptians would have faced a problem. Here was a massive monument, the largest sculpture in their land, standing as undeniable evidence that someone had preceded them. Someone with the power to carve mountains. Someone whose works dwarfed anything the pharaohs could achieve. Leaving the original face intact would mean perpetually acknowledging this predecessor. Every person who saw the Sphinx would be reminded that the pharaohs were not first, that greater beings had come before, and that the current rulers were inheritors rather than originators. For a culture built on the divine authority of pharaonic rule, this was an unacceptable situation. The solution was recarving, not destruction, which would have been nearly impossible given the Sphinx's size and which would have eliminated a valuable symbol of power. But transformation. The original face was removed and replaced with a pharaonic face. The monument was claimed for the current dynasty. That the connection to Zep-Tepi was severed, or at least obscured. The Sphinx became Egyptian rather than pre-Egyptian. It became a symbol of pharaonic power rather than a reminder of what came before. This interpretation explains several puzzling features of Egyptian attitudes toward the Sphinx. It explains why no construction records exist, because the Egyptians did not build it, but only modified it. It explains why early references treat the Sphinx as already ancient and mysterious, because it was already ancient when the pharaohs found it. It explains why the proportions are wrong, because the current head was carved from a larger original that better fit the body. And it explains why the Egyptians might have wanted to hide the truth, because the truth threatened their authority, because the truth revealed that they were not the first great civilization, because the truth connected them to beings they could not fully understand or control. But this raises a deeper question. If the Egyptians merely wanted to claim the Sphinx for themselves, they could have done so while still acknowledging its ancient origins. They could have built a mythology that celebrated them as the inheritors of Zep-Tepi, the rightful successors to divine rule. Instead, they seem to have actively concealed the Sphinx's true age and origins. The records that should exist do not exist. The questions that should be asked are not asked. The investigations that should occur are prevented. This suggests something more than simple political appropriation. This suggests fear, not fear of predecessors who might return to reclaim their throne. The gods of Zep-Tepi had departed long before the pharaohs arose. They posed no practical political threat. The fear seems to be of knowledge itself, of what the Sphinx represented, of what its original form revealed about the beings who built it. Of what memories might be awakened if people looked too closely at the evidence of a world before Egypt. Perhaps the gods of Zep-Tepi were not gods at all in the sense we understand that term. Perhaps they were something else, something the later Egyptians did not fully understand, something they preferred not to think about too carefully, something they decided was better left buried beneath the sands of the desert and the stone of a recarved face. And so, a picture begins to emerge, a monument far older than the civilization that claims it. A face that was changed to hide its origins. A history systematically erased and rewritten. The ancient Egyptians knew something about the beings who came before them, something that required not just forgetting, but active concealment. Let this picture settle in your mind as you rest. The first time, the divine rulers, the departure, the inheritance, the transformation, the erasure. Each piece connects to the next, forming a pattern that points toward truths that have been hidden for thousands of years. But what could be so terrifying about the past that it needed to be literally carved away? To understand, we must examine what the ancient texts say happened at the end of Zep-Tepi. Not how the gods departed, but why. Approximately 12,900 years ago, something catastrophic happened to the Earth. The evidence is written in ice cores, in ocean sediments, in the bones of extinct animals, and in the scarred landscapes of multiple continents. Scientists call this period the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic flower that suddenly reappeared in regions where it had not grown for thousands of years. The Younger Dryas marks one of the most dramatic climate reversals in the geological record. After thousands of years of gradual warming, as the last ice age slowly released its grip on the planet, temperatures suddenly plunged. In some regions, the drop was as much as 7 degrees Celsius in a matter of decades. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. Ecosystems that had adapted to warming conditions were thrown into chaos. And then, approximately 11,600 years ago, the cold ended as abruptly as it had begun. Temperatures surged upward. Ice sheets that had stabilized began melting rapidly. Sea levels rose dramatically, to perhaps as much as 400 feet over the following millennia. Coastlines that had supported human settlements for thousands of years disappeared beneath the waves. The world that emerged from the younger Dryas was fundamentally different from the world that had existed before. What caused this catastrophic climate swing has been debated for decades. The conventional explanation involves disruptions to ocean circulation patterns, perhaps triggered by massive influxes of fresh water from melting glaciers. But in recent years, a more dramatic hypothesis has gained scientific support. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that the Earth was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet approximately 12,900 years ago. The evidence includes a distinct layer of sediment found across multiple continents containing nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, and other markers consistent with cosmic impact. This boundary layer appears at exactly the moment when temperatures began their sudden plunge. Impact sites have been proposed in North America, where the Laurentide ice sheet would have absorbed much of the evidence, and more recently in Greenland, where a massive crater lies buried beneath the ice. If this hypothesis is correct, the implications are staggering. A cometary impact of sufficient magnitude would have caused immediate devastation across wide areas. The airbursts and surface impacts would have generated massive fires. Dust and debris thrown into the atmosphere would have blocked sunlight, triggering rapid cooling. The destabilization of ice sheets would have caused catastrophic flooding as ice dams burst and meltwater surged across continents. The extinction of megafauna across North America and other regions, long attributed to human hunting or gradual climate change, might instead reflect the sudden destruction of ecosystems by cosmic bombardment. This is the context in which some researchers have proposed a radical reinterpretation of human prehistory. The author and journalist Graham Hancock has spent decades investigating the possibility that an advanced human civilization existed before the Younger Dryas and was largely destroyed by the Cataclysm. Hancock does not claim this civilization possessed technology equivalent to our own. He proposes something different. A sophisticated society with advanced knowledge of astronomy, architecture, agriculture, and navigation. A society capable of building monuments that aligned with celestial phenomena. A society that understood the cycles of precession and encoded this knowledge in their constructions. A society that was devastated when fragments of a comet struck the Earth and triggered a global catastrophe. According to this interpretation, the survivors of this lost civilization did not simply disappear. They scattered across the world, carrying their knowledge with them. They encountered hunter-gatherer populations who had survived the cataclysm and shared their wisdom. They taught agriculture to people who had never planted crops. They taught architecture to people who had never built in stone. They taught astronomy to people who had never tracked the movements of stars. These survivors, Hancock suggests, are remembered in the myths of cultures worldwide. The Egyptians remembered them as the Neteru, the gods of Zep-Tepi. The Sumerians remembered them as the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The Mesoamericans remembered them as Quetzalcoatl and the other feathered serpents who brought civilization from across the sea. The Greeks remembered them as the Titans, the gods who ruled before the Olympians. Everywhere the pattern repeats. On divine beings or culture heroes who arrived after a great catastrophe, who taught the arts of civilization, who eventually departed or died, leaving behind monuments and memories. Now consider the Sphinx in this context. Robert Schoch's geological analysis suggests the monument was carved no later than 5000 BCE and possibly as early as 10,000 BCE or beyond. The Younger Dryas ended approximately 11,600 years ago. If the Sphinx predates the Cataclysm, it would be a surviving artifact of the lost civilization. A monument built before the floods and fires, somehow preserved through the destruction. Its water erosion patterns would make perfect sense. It would have stood through thousands of years of rainfall during the African humid period that preceded the current desert conditions. It would have witnessed the green Sahara become sand. It would have watched as new peoples arrived on the Nile, inheriting a land still marked by monuments they did not build. If the Sphinx postdates the Cataclysm but predates dynastic Egypt, it might have been built by survivors, the last remnants of a dying civilization encoding their knowledge in stone before they vanished entirely. A message left for future generations, a timestamp marking the age of Leo, when the constellation rose behind the monument at the spring equinox. A guardian set to watch over something hidden beneath its paws. Either interpretation points to the same conclusion. The Sphinx belongs to a chapter of human history that has been lost. A chapter that ended in catastrophe. A chapter whose survivors became the gods and culture heroes of later civilizations. A chapter that the inheritors of Egypt preferred to forget. Consider what the world would have looked like to the early Egyptians. They arose as a unified civilization around 3100 BCE, thousands of years after the Younger Dryas cataclysm. The Green Sahara was already transitioning to desert. The survivors of any previous civilization would have long since died or interbred with local populations. But the monuments remained. Imagine encountering the Sphinx for the first time. A massive stone figure carved from the living rock of the plateau, weathered by rains that no longer fell, shaped by hands whose owners had vanished beyond memory. What would you make of such a thing? What stories would you tell to explain it? You might conclude that gods had built it, beings greater than humans, with powers beyond comprehension. You might worship it, leaving offerings at its feet. You might build your own monuments nearby, trying to connect your civilization to whatever power had created this ancient guardian. You might fear it, this evidence of predecessors who had possessed abilities you could not match. You might wonder if they were truly gone. If a global catastrophe destroyed a previous civilization, it would explain why we find monuments like the Sphinx, with no record of their construction. It would explain why ancient cultures worldwide share flood myths. And it would explain something darker, why the survivors might have been feared by the humans who came after them. Imagine encountering beings who remembered the world before. Beings who possessed knowledge that seemed like magic. Beings who knew the movements of stars, the secrets of agriculture, the principles of architecture. To a hunter-gatherer population still recovering from global catastrophe, such beings would have seemed divine. They would have been treated with awe and reverence. They would have been called gods. But gods are dangerous. Gods make demands. Gods can be capricious, benevolent one moment and wrathful the next. The myths of every culture include stories of divine anger, of punishments meted out to humans who displeased their creators. The flood itself might have been remembered as divine punishment. Perhaps the catastrophe that destroyed the previous civilization was understood by later peoples as the wrath of the gods. Perhaps the survivors were both revered and feared, welcomed for their knowledge, but dreaded for their connection to powers that could destroy worlds. When these survivors finally departed, whether through death, dispersal, or some form of ascension, their absence left a void. The knowledge they had shared remained, passed down through generations of priests and initiates. The monuments they had built remained, standing as undeniable evidence of their existence. But the beings themselves were gone, and in their absence, questions lingered. Would they return? Did they watch from some distant realm? Were they pleased or displeased with how their inheritors had used their gifts? The recarving of the Sphinx might have been an attempt to answer these questions, or rather, to make them irrelevant. By removing the original face and replacing it with a pharaonic image, the early Egyptians were not simply claiming the monument for themselves. They were severing its connection to the previous age. They were transforming a reminder of the gods into a symbol of human kingship. They were saying, in effect, this belongs to us now. Whatever came before is finished. We are the masters of this land. The gods have departed, and we have taken their place. But this transformation required more than recarving. It required a new mythology, one that acknowledged Zep-Tepi as a sacred era while firmly placing it in the past. The gods had ruled, yes. The gods had been glorious, yes. But the gods had chosen to depart, leaving humanity to govern itself. The pharaohs were not usurpers, but rightful successors, carrying divine blood in their veins, maintaining cosmic order in the gods' absence. This mythology served multiple purposes. It legitimized pharaonic rule by connecting it to divine precedent. It explained the existence of monuments that predated Egyptian memory. It satisfied the human need to understand where we come from and why the world is the way it is. And it closed the door on the previous age, sealing it safely in the realm of sacred history, where it could be honored without being examined too closely. Similar patterns appear in other cultures. Throughout the world, indigenous peoples have inherited ruins and monuments built by unknown predecessors. The megalithic temples of Malta, the Cyclopean walls of Peru, the mysterious Moai of Easter Island. In each case, the inheriting culture developed mythologies to explain what they had found. Gods built it. Giants built it. Culture heroes from across the sea built it. The ancestors whose names have been forgotten built it. These explanations share a common structure. They acknowledge that something existed before. They attribute its creation to beings of supernatural or superhuman power. And they firmly place those beings in the past, no longer present but still honored, no longer threatening but still respected. The fear is not of the monuments themselves, but of what they represent. Evidence that we are not the first, that others came before, that the world contains depths of history we cannot fully comprehend, that our certainties about human civilization might be built on foundations we do not understand. This fear helps explain why the possibility of a lost civilization generates such resistance from mainstream academia. The evidence is dismissed not simply because it is weak, but because its implications are disturbing. If human civilization is far older than we have been taught, then much of what we think we know about history must be reconsidered. If catastrophes can destroy advanced societies so completely that only scattered monuments remain, then our own civilization's permanence is called into question. If the myths of gods and culture heroes reflect memories of real beings, then the boundary between history and mythology becomes disturbingly unclear. It is easier to maintain that the Sphinx was built by Khafre around 2500 BCE. It is easier to dismiss water erosion as alternative weathering mechanisms, and it is easier to attribute flood myths to local disasters rather than global cataclysms. It is easier to believe that human civilization followed a steady progression from primitive to advanced, with no lost chapters, no forgotten predecessors, no uncomfortable mysteries. And so, the face was changed, not out of vandalism, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity. The old gods were gone. The new rulers needed the power the Sphinx represented. But they also needed to sever its connection to beings who might challenge their authority. Beings who, according to the texts, had promised to return. But what if they never truly left? This question brings us back to the chambers beneath the Sphinx. We discussed earlier the seismic surveys conducted by Robert Schoch's team, which detected a rectangular anomaly beneath the left paw of the monument. But Schoch was not the only researcher to find evidence of subsurface voids. In 1991, a team using ground-penetrating radar identified multiple cavities around and beneath the Sphinx. A Japanese team, led by Sakuji Yoshimura, detected hollow spaces at several locations. In 1996, a Florida State University team found evidence of tunnels and chambers beneath the monument. Multiple independent surveys using different technologies have converged on the same conclusion. Something exists beneath the Sphinx. The spaces may be natural cavities in the limestone bedrock, or they may be constructed chambers deliberately excavated by the builders of the Sphinx for purposes we can only imagine. The surveys cannot determine the contents of these spaces without physical investigation. But physical investigation has been blocked. The Egyptian government, through the Supreme Council of Antiquities and its successors, has consistently denied permission for excavation or detailed subsurface exploration around the Sphinx. Requests by qualified archaeologists and geologists have been refused. Proposals for non-invasive investigation using modern imaging technologies have been rejected or indefinitely delayed. The official position is that such investigations might damage the monument, or that the anomalies are simply natural features not worth investigating. These explanations strain credulity. Modern archaeology possesses technologies that can investigate underground spaces without excavation. Fiber optic cameras can be inserted through small boreholes. Advanced radar and seismic tomography can map subsurface features in extraordinary detail. If the authorities genuinely believed the chambers were natural and uninteresting, proving this would silence the speculation that has swirled around the Sphinx for decades. Instead, the speculation is allowed to continue, fed by the refusal to investigate. The chambers beneath the Sphinx have become a canvas for imagination and hope. Soon in the 1930s, the American mystic Edgar Cayce predicted that a haul of records would be discovered beneath the Sphinx before the end of the 20th century. This haul, Cayce claimed, contained records of human civilization extending back to the lost continent of Atlantis, the The discovery would revolutionize human understanding of history and trigger a new age of spiritual awareness. Casey's prediction was not fulfilled in his specified time frame, and his claims about Atlantis remained firmly in the realm of speculation. But the seismic evidence suggesting that chambers actually exist beneath the Sphinx gives his prediction an uncomfortable resonance. What if something is down there? Not necessarily Atlantean records or mystical artifacts, but perhaps records of the previous age, perhaps documents or inscriptions from Zep-Tepi, perhaps physical evidence of who really built the Sphinx and when. Perhaps something that would force a complete rewriting of ancient history. The fear of what might be found may explain the reluctance to look. If the chambers are empty, investigation would prove this and nothing would change. But if the chambers contain evidence that contradicts the accepted history of Egypt, the implications would be enormous. Egyptology as a discipline would face a crisis. The carefully constructed narrative of pharaonic civilization would require radical revision. The connection between modern Egypt and ancient Egypt, so important to national identity and tourism revenue, might be complicated by evidence of unknown predecessors. Perhaps more troubling would be the implications for our understanding of human history generally. If the chambers contained evidence of a pre-catastrophe civilization, evidence dating back beyond the Younger Dryas, it would confirm what alternative researchers have long suspected: that human history is far older than the textbooks claim, that advanced societies existed and were destroyed, that we are not the first attempt at civilization, but merely the latest, that the progress we celebrate may have been achieved before and lost. Such knowledge would be destabilizing. It would undermine the narrative of continuous human advancement that underlies so much of modern thought. It would raise uncomfortable questions about cycles of rise and fall, about the fragility of civilization, about whether our own society might face the same fate as its forgotten predecessors. It would transform the Sphinx from an ancient curiosity into an urgent warning. Perhaps the authorities who refuse to investigate the chambers are not engaged in conspiracy. Perhaps they simply prefer not to know. Perhaps the human capacity for denial extends to entire institutions, entire nations, entire disciplines. Perhaps it is easier to leave the chambers sealed and the questions unanswered than to confront whatever truths might lie beneath the pores of the Sphinx. Or perhaps the chambers were long ago emptied. Perhaps the builders of the Sphinx, or their successors, or the early pharaohs who recarved its face, removed whatever had been stored below. Perhaps the Hall of Records exists, but was transferred to some other location, hidden in a place where it has not been found or has been found and kept secret. Perhaps the real mysteries are not beneath the Sphinx at all, but hidden elsewhere, waiting for discovery, or already discovered and concealed. We cannot know what lies beneath without investigation. And investigation has been prevented. This fact alone speaks volumes. The Sphinx guards its secrets as it has guarded them for millennia. Its recarved face gazes east toward the rising sun, revealing nothing. Its worn body bears the marks of water that fell in another age. Its paws rest above chambers that may hold nothing or everything. And the authorities who control access prefer that we do not look too closely. Perhaps one day those chambers will be opened. Perhaps political changes in Egypt will bring new leadership more open to investigation. Perhaps advancing technology will allow non-invasive imaging detailed enough to settle the question without excavation. Perhaps some future discovery elsewhere will provide context that makes investigation of the Sphinx chambers irresistible even to those who currently resist. Or perhaps the chambers will remain sealed. Perhaps the questions will go unanswered for another century, another millennium, another cycle of civilizations rising and falling and rising again. Perhaps the Sphinx will outlast our curiosity as it has outlasted so many civilizations before. Perhaps it will still be gazing east when whatever comes after us arrives to wonder at its mysteries. But tonight, as we rest with these mysteries, let us consider what the Sphinx truly represents. Not just a monument, not just a riddle, but a guardian, standing watch over secrets that have been kept for over 12,000 years, waiting. Let us shift now from what was hidden to what was meant to be found, because there is another way to understand the Sphinx, not as a secret to be kept, but as a message to be delivered, not as a mystery concealing truth, but as a beacon transmitting it across the ages. Consider the possibility that whoever built the Sphinx intended for us to discover exactly what we have been discussing tonight. The proportional anomaly that reveals the recarving, the water erosion that reveals the true age, the astronomical alignments that reveal the intended date. Perhaps these were not accidents or oversights. Now, perhaps they were deliberate markers, encoded into the monument by builders who knew that future generations would eventually develop the tools to read them. This interpretation transforms everything. The Sphinx becomes not a riddle to frustrate us, but a letter addressed to us across 12,000 years of silence. The builders knew they would not survive. They knew their civilization would end, whether through catastrophe or simply the passage of time. But they also knew that stone endures. They knew that a monument carved from the living bedrock of a plateau would outlast empires and dynasties and perhaps even the memory of its creators. And so, they built something designed to communicate across the ages. They encoded their message in the most durable language they knew, the language of stone, the language of proportion, the language of the stars. The astronomical alignments of the Giza Plateau have fascinated researchers for decades. In 1994, the author Robert Bauval proposed what he called the Orion correlation theory. Bauval noticed that the three pyramids of Giza, when viewed from above, form a pattern that mirrors the three stars of Orion's belt. The correlation is not perfect, which has led to debate about whether it is intentional or coincidental. But the basic observation is striking. The two larger pyramids correspond to the two brighter stars. The smaller pyramid corresponds to the dimmer star, and the offset of the third pyramid from the line formed by the first two matches the offset of the third star from its companions. If this correlation is intentional, it suggests the builders of Giza were encoding astronomical information into their monuments. They were creating a map of the sky on the ground. They were linking their sacred site to the heavens in a way that would be recognizable to anyone who knew how to look. The Sphinx fits into this astronomical framework. It faces due east, toward the rising sun on the equinoxes. During the age of Leo, approximately 10,500 years before the Common Era, the constellation Leo rose directly behind the Sphinx at the spring equinox. A lion monument would have been gazing at its celestial counterpart. The correlation would have been unmistakable to anyone who understood precession. The slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the zodiacal constellations to shift their positions over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years. This astronomical encoding suggests extraordinary sophistication. The builders understood precession, a phenomenon so subtle that it was not officially discovered until the Greek astronomer Hipparchus identified it in the 2nd century BCE. The builders could calculate the positions of stars thousands of years in the future. The builders designed monuments that would communicate their intended date to anyone with sufficient astronomical knowledge. They were sending a message through time, and they expected that someone, someday, would receive it. Perhaps that someone is us. Consider the sequence of discoveries we have traced tonight. The proportional anomaly of the Sphinx was always visible but not widely discussed until researchers began questioning the accepted narrative. The water erosion was always present but not analyzed by geologists until Schoch brought his expertise to bear. The astronomical alignments were always calculable but not publicized until Beauval and others developed the precession hypothesis. Each discovery built on the previous ones. Each required a specific kind of knowledge that did not exist in earlier eras. Geology, astronomy, precise measurement, computer modeling of ancient skies. The message could not have been decoded before the 20th century. It required technologies and analytical frameworks that simply did not exist in earlier ages. But it can be decoded now. We possess the tools to read what the builders wrote. We have geologists who can date stone by its erosion patterns. We have astronomers who can model the sky as it appeared 12,000 years ago. We have engineers who can analyze the proportions of ancient monuments. And we have archaeologists who can compare texts across cultures. We have all the pieces necessary to understand the message. The question is whether we will listen, whether we will take seriously what the evidence suggests, whether we will allow ourselves to consider possibilities that challenge our assumptions about history. The builders, whoever they were, took an enormous risk. They trusted that future generations would be curious enough to investigate, and they trusted that future technologies would be sophisticated enough to decode their message. They trusted that future minds would be open enough to accept what they found. They built their monument, and then they vanished, leaving only stone and silence and hope. That hope was invested in us. We are the intended recipients of a letter that took 12,000 years to arrive. We are the audience for a performance staged before our civilization existed. We are the inheritors of knowledge that was preserved specifically so that we might one day understand it. This is not a burden. It is a privilege to be alive at the moment when the message can finally be read, to possess the tools that unlock the meaning, to stand at the threshold between mystery and understanding. Whatever conclusions we ultimately reach about the Sphinx, this much is certain. We are participating in a conversation across time. We are listening to voices that fell silent millennia ago. We are receiving a transmission from the deep past, encoded in stone by minds that knew exactly what they were doing. Let us now gather what we have learned and hold it together in our minds. The physical evidence tells a consistent story. The head of the Sphinx is too small for its body, indicating that it was recarved from a larger original. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx and its enclosure show the distinctive signatures of water weathering, which requires prolonged exposure to rainfall that has not occurred in the region for at least 5,000 years. Seismic surveys have detected anomalies beneath the Sphinx, suggesting the presence of chambers or cavities that have never been excavated or properly investigated. The textual evidence tells a complementary story. No Egyptian document describes the construction of the Sphinx, despite the existence of detailed records for virtually every other major monument. The first known textual reference to the Sphinx appears more than 1,000 years after its supposed construction date and treats it as already ancient and mysterious. Egyptian records speak of Zep-Tepi, the first time when divine beings ruled the land before human pharaohs. Sumerian records speak of the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the heavens and established civilization. Multiple ancient cultures preserve memories of a time when gods walked the earth and eventually departed. The mainstream archaeological position dismisses most of this evidence. The proportional anomaly is attributed to artistic choice or poor planning. The water erosion is attributed to alternative weathering mechanisms that do not require rainfall. The seismic anomalies are attributed to natural variations in the limestone bedrock. The textual references to divine rulers are attributed to mythology and religious symbolism, not intended to be taken literally. The absence of construction records is attributed to lost documents. Each individual anomaly can be explained away if examined in isolation. But the pattern that emerges when all the evidence is considered together is harder to dismiss. A monument with the wrong proportions. Erosion that requires thousands of years of rainfall. Chambers that authorities refuse to investigate. Records that speak of divine predecessors. Cultures across the ancient world that remember the same sequence of events. Divine beings who once ruled. Knowledge that was shared with humanity. A departure that ended the Golden Age. Monuments left behind as evidence of what had been. Either all of this is coincidence, independent inventions, the parallel mythologies arising from universal psychological needs. Or it is memory, fragmentary, distorted, adapted and readapted through countless retellings, but fundamentally rooted in events that actually occurred. We cannot prove which interpretation is correct. The evidence supports both possibilities, and neither can be definitively ruled out. But the refusal to seriously investigate the alternative interpretation is itself revealing. The resistance to questioning the accepted narrative, and the dismissal of credentialed scientists like Schoch, the blocking of excavations beneath the Sphinx, the insistence that 12,000-year-old erosion patterns must have some other explanation because an older Sphinx would be impossible. This resistance suggests that something important is at stake, not just academic reputations or institutional pride, but something deeper, a particular story about human history that we have invested in, a narrative of continuous progress from primitive beginnings to modern sophistication, a belief that we are the pinnacle of human achievement, the most advanced civilization ever to exist. The possibility of a lost civilization threatens this narrative. It suggests that advancement is not permanent, that sophisticated societies can be destroyed and forgotten, that our own achievements might someday be reduced to mysterious ruins that future peoples cannot explain. Now, this is uncomfortable knowledge. It is easier to deny than to accept. But the Sphinx stands regardless of what we believe. The erosion patterns exist regardless of how we explain them. The chambers beneath the monument contain whatever they contain, regardless of whether we investigate. Truth does not require our acceptance to remain true. What we choose to do with the evidence is another matter. We can continue to accept the mainstream narrative with its convenient dates and comfortable certainties. We can dismiss the anomalies as unimportant and trust that the experts have everything under control. We can go about our lives as if the deep past holds no mysteries worth investigating. Or we can remain curious. We can continue to ask questions even when the answers disturb us. We can hold the evidence in our minds and wonder what it means. We can accept that we do not have all the answers and that the search for truth is ongoing. We can remember that the greatest discoveries often come from those who were willing to question what everyone else accepted. The builders of the Sphinx, whoever they were, trusted that we would be worthy of their message. They trusted that we would investigate, that we would think, that we would wonder, that we would not simply accept what we were told, but would look at the evidence with our own eyes and draw our own conclusions. Perhaps that trust was justified. Perhaps we are beginning to remember what was forgotten. Perhaps the message is finally being received after 12,000 years of waiting. Or perhaps we will return to our comfortable certainties and allow the questions to fade. Either way, the Sphinx will continue its vigil. Let the night settle around you now. Let the questions we have explored together find their resting place in your mind, not demanding answers, not creating anxiety, simply present, simply waiting, like the Sphinx itself. Across the world at this very moment, the Sphinx gazes east toward the horizon where the sun will rise. It has watched from this position for longer than any human civilization has existed. It watched the stars of Leo rise behind it when the Sahara was green. It watched the rains end and the desert begin. It watched the first Egyptians arrive and puzzle over its presence. It watched them recarve its face, replacing whatever had been there before with the features of their king. It watched dynasties rise and fall. It watched Alexander arrive. It watched Rome arrive. It watched the Arabs arrive. It watched Napoleon arrive and his soldiers use it for target practice. It watched archaeologists arrive with their theories and their certainties. It watched tourists arrive with their cameras and their questions. And still, it watches. The face has changed, but the body remembers. The stone holds patterns carved by water that fell in another age. The proportions reveal alterations made by hands that have been dust for thousands of years. The chambers beneath remain sealed, holding whatever they hold, patient and undisturbed. Perhaps one day we will finally understand what the Sphinx guards. Perhaps the chambers will be opened and the records of a lost age will be revealed. Perhaps technologies we cannot yet imagine will decode messages we do not yet perceive. Perhaps the full story will emerge and the mysteries will be resolved, and the questions that have haunted us for centuries will finally have answers. Or perhaps the Sphinx's greatest secret is simply this: that we are not the first, that others came before us and built wonders we still cannot explain, that they faced catastrophes we can barely imagine and did not survive, that they left behind monuments as their only message to a future they would never see, and that we are that future. We are the recipients of their hope. We are the audience they imagined when they set their message in stone. We are the distant descendants who would one day stand before their works and wonder who they were and what they knew and why they vanished from the earth. The Sphinx does not answer our questions. It only poses them. It only watches. It only waits. And in that watching and waiting, there is a kind of peace. The peace of knowing that some mysteries are not meant to be solved quickly, that some questions require generations to answer, that the search for truth is itself a kind of truth, that wondering is itself a form of understanding. Rest now with this mystery. Let the questions settle like sand across stone. The Sphinx has kept its secrets for 12,000 years. It will keep them a little longer. Your curiosity honors the builders who hoped someone would wonder. Your questions continue a conversation that began before history. Your willingness to consider possibilities that others dismiss is itself a form of courage. And perhaps in the stillness of this night, something ancient stirs, not the gods returning, not Zep-Tepi restored, but something older and more subtle, the first faint stirring of remembrance, a sense that we have been here before. That civilization has risen and risen again more times than we remember. That the cycles continue regardless of what we believe about them, that we are part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. The Sphinx knows this. It has watched the cycles turn. It will watch them turn again. And somewhere in the stones of Giza, in the erosion patterns and the hidden chambers and the astronomical alignments, the message waits. Patient, enduring, confident that someday someone will fully understand. Perhaps that understanding begins tonight. Perhaps in the quiet hours before sleep, something shifts. Perhaps the questions we have explored together plant seeds that will grow in ways we cannot predict. Perhaps years from now, you will encounter some piece of evidence, some fragment of ancient text, some anomaly that others overlook, and something will click into place. Perhaps you will remember this night and the mystery we explored together and the feeling of standing at the threshold of understanding. The Sphinx would approve. It was built by beings who valued knowledge, who preserved what they learned, who trusted that truth would eventually emerge from darkness, who built monuments that would outlast their civilization and carry their message into ages they would never see. You are part of that message now. You have received the transmission. What you do with it is yours to decide. The night is deep. The stars are turning. Somewhere in Egypt, the Sphinx watches the horizon, as it has for 100 centuries. And in the silence between heartbeats, between thoughts, between waking and sleep, the ancient world whispers its secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. Good night.